another story that I've been working with recently, because I've been trying to research into plant folklore and stories about plants, because I have this question about how do people learn about things before reading and writing? Well, a lot of the time it would have been through stories, right? And if you think about how the common people have used plants as medicine, as food for, for millennia, yeah, then stories have some part in that. So I'm really curious about what are the stories that occupy that space, kind of in between the folklore and stories and the medicinal uses of plants. And I actually haven't found as many stories as I hoped I would, though there are lots of traces and bits of pieces. But there's one story that in fact my herbal medicine tutor put me onto. She said, "Oh yes, I used to use this story when I did stuff with groups," and it's in a book. There's a book by a chap called Richard Folkard, Folkard, and he assembled loads of plant folklore. Now this book is from 18 something. So it's quite an old book. You can go and find it off the internet and download it. It has lots and lots of plant folklore in it. But she directed me, my tutor directed me, and so it was like, oh yeah, I think the mugwort story in there. So I went and I found it. And this is how that story goes. Once upon a time in Russia, not far from the border with Belarus and Ukraine, there lived a girl in a village, very ordinary girl, very ordinary village. And at the time the story begins, it was the autumn. It was not far from I think the Feast of the Ascension, something like that, in the autumn time, and it was the time when people would go out to the forest to pick mushrooms. This is a big thing in Russia and Eastern Europe. You pick the mushrooms around the time that you get all the mushrooms, and they're a great thing, aren't they? Mushrooms, you can dry them, you can keep them through the winter when you need some quality food. So this girl was wandering through the forest, and the trees were covered in their orange and yellow leaves, and she was looking out for mushrooms here and there. And all of a sudden she saw a patch of a plant that in Welsh is called a feidiogluid. And it has lots of other names in Welsh as well. It's also known as a ganraislwyd. It's got a lot of because it's got a lot of little scrappy roots. It's also known as a riskenlwyd because it's got like grey stalks. Because this is one of these plants where the top of the leaf is sort of a dark green, and then the underside of the leaf is kind of like a silvery colour. And its name in English is mugwort. But she saw a patch of these mugworts standing there, and then she looked down to see if there were mushrooms. But rather than mushrooms underneath the mugwort, there were snakes. Snakes that were curled up and having a bit of a nap in the autumn sun. So all of a sudden she stopped and carefully stepped backwards away from the snakes, only she tripped. She tripped over a root, and she fell. And not only did she fall to the ground, she found herself falling down into the earth. There was a pit, and she scrabbled at the sides of the pit with her hands, grasping onto the roots or anything she could, but to no avail. She fell down the pit with a thud. Well, it took her a little while to gather herself in the pit, and she found she was holding onto a stone that she must have grabbed from up near the roots of the mugwort. And the curious thing, this stone was glowing. And then by the light of this stone, she looked around the pit to see there were snakes in the pit too. And she thought, oh dear, I'll just stay very, very still. Maybe they won't spot me. Maybe I'll think of something I can do. And she just stayed there with a glowing rock in her hand. And after a moment or two, the snakes started to edge closer. And then one really big snake started to slither up to her. And this thing, its head was nearly as big as hers. And it had kind of like these orange horns on its head. And then the snake spoke, "Welcome. May I taste the rock that you have in your hand? It does look lovely." Well, the girl didn't want to, what would you say to a giant snake? I said, "Oh, yeah, yeah, sure, sure, be my guest." And this snake leaned forward and began to lick and to nibble at the rock. Mmm, so nutritious. And then other snakes came forward as well. And there were all these snakes sort of sniffing at the rock and licking at it with their forked tongues. And she just stayed very, very still. Well, after they'd finished eating, the big snake said, "I should have introduced myself. I am the queen of the snakes. Welcome to our world. Aren't you hungry? Don't you want some food too? You can eat it too, you know." Well, the girl thought she'd better do what the snake said, just in case. So she looked. It didn't really taste nice. It tasted sort of minerally, but maybe it was nutritious. It was, yeah. "Thank you," said the girl. And then the queen of the snakes began to chat to her. And slowly, over some time, the girl grew to be more comfortable around the snakes, and the snakes explained to her their way of life below the ground. And the girl explained her way of life in that very ordinary village above the ground that seemed so far away now. And so it was that she stayed in that pit quite some time, not just days, not just weeks, not just months. Through the winter, whilst the snow fell above and the pit was quite covered over with the snow. Through the winter, she stayed there and she learnt many things from those snakes. But one day after the snow had begun to melt, she could smell the spring. She could smell the plants that were growing up there above the ground. And the queen of the snakes turned around to her and goes and said, "My dear, it has been lovely having you stay, but it is time for you to go back to your world now. I will give you a gift. I will give you a gift, and the gift is this: that when you go back above ground with your ears, you will be able to hear the voices of the plants and the trees and the green things. But this gift is conditional because we don't want to be discovered down here, so you must never, ever speak the name of the plant that guards our realm." And the girl went, "Well, okay, I think I can do that. Thank you so much for the gift. Thank you so much for keeping me alive through the winter. And I think this rock, I think you should keep it, Snakes. I'm going to leave that here as my gift to you." "Thank you," said the Queen of the Snakes. And then several snakes began to form themselves into a ladder. They plaited themselves into a ladder, and on the ladder, the girl could climb up and out of the pit, and she was back in the forest. And as she headed towards home and began to walk, it was not only her eyes that were delighted by the sign of green shoots coming up, but she could hear, "Hello, hello, I am a nettle. Would you like to chew on my tasty leaves? Hello, hello, I am some cleavers, some sticky willy. I can help your uncle who has gout." And as she walked, all these different voices were arriving in her ears, and it was the voices of the plants. And so she not only saw the plants with fresh eyes, but heard them too. Well, she got back to the village, and everybody was so delighted because they thought that she would have been dead and gone long ago. So they were very pleased to have her back. And with her newfound knowledge, her newfound skill of being able to hear the plants, she found that she could keep herself very well by working as a plant healer, by connecting the medicinal properties of the plants with those people that needed them for their gout, for their rheumatism, for their sticky lungs, and for all the ailments of the people of that village. And so it was that she lived her days working with the plants and dispensing remedies, and in time she taught those around her what the plants were used for too. And by the time she was an old lady, well, she had her very own. She was quite well to do, really. She had her own cottage. And around the walls of that cottage were lots of little jars with dried herbs and things in oil and tinctures and all sorts of wonderful plant medicines. Well, one day she was going for a walk not far from the village. And a man was walking the other day and he said, Mrs., you know about the plants, don't you? What's that one over there in that field? And she, Fiona knows what's going to happen. She's heard the story.
Bad, no, bad feelings.
She looked over there. Why, that's mugwort, of course. And in a moment, everything seemed a bit quieter than it had been. Something was missing, but she wasn't sure what it was. And when she got back to her cottage, all those jars, all those things, she thought they looked beautiful, but she could not recognize one from the other. And that was the beginning of her forgetting. And fortunately, she'd trained up a lot of people out around her. So the apprentices took over working with the people and with the plants. And she simply lived out the rest of her days in a quiet way. People brought her food, people looked after her. But the last joy of her life was to sit in the sun and to drink a cup of mugwort tea. Because when she drank the mugwort tea for a moment, it was as if she could hear something she had forgotten. She could hear voices that she could no longer hear, She could remember things that had vanished out of her brain. So dyma stori o feidio glywyd. That's a story about the mugwort plant.
Oh, it is.